Two.
Okay, we have David Eads of Free Geek Chicago. We have Dr. Borja Sotomayor, researcher at the Computation Institute of the University of Chicago. We also have Elizabeth Martin, Director of Security Services of Red Leg. I have some prepared questions. Gaming industry. They say that Linux users are cheapskates. Defend or refute?
Do I get this thing? Both. Yeah, so if people haven't heard about it, there's a company out there called Humble Bundle. Have people heard about this? Refuting the answer that Linux users are cheapskates, they always have a breakdown on there. They sell between $500,000 and $2 million worth of video games in a short period, about 2 weeks, and they give you a nice breakdown, a nice pie chart of where the money is coming from. And on average, the window, I'm going to make this number up. Y'all okay? Good.
Because all statistics are lies, right?
Yes, including the quote itself is not actually by Mark Twain. I'm going to make these numbers up, but they're roughly accurate. It's something like, they break it down, like Windows users are on average, because they ask you when you go to download your games you've bought, if you want to be counted, tell us what platform you play on. And they fill it in by default by what your web browser is. So if you're on Linux, they'll check the Linux box for you. But you can change it however you want. You can be like, well, I use Mac and Linux, so let's check both of those. So, and they'll count you for both. But the statistical average right now is that, well, I'll tell you right now exactly what it is. Because there's for the next day and a half, there's a sale going on right now on humblebundle.com. Bundle.com. And at this very minute in time, this is the breakdown. Scroll down here. Okay, total payments. This is a low-selling one. They're almost to $700,000 for this 2-week promotion. 100,000 purchases. The average purchase price is $6. The average, or $6.42. The average Windows user is paying $5.72. So they're paying below average. They're dragging it down for everyone. The average Mac person is paying $7.06. So they're a little above that average. The average Linux person is paying $9.93. Way above the average. And this is not a statistical fluke either. Every single Humble Bundle, this is like the 8th or 9th of these we've done, every single one of them, these statistics have played out like this. If you look at the pie chart where it says total payments by platform, Linux is almost double what the Mac people are paying right now. Linux is double what the Mac people are. Windows is the vast majority of it because that's just where all the warm bodies are. You can't do anything about that. But between the two platforms that are comparable in terms of market share, Linux is easily double what the Mac people are paying. So, and now think about this. What do you think about when you see Mac user? You think rich asshole, too much money, right? Sorry, Mac users, I'm using a Mac myself. But the stereotype, you know, if we're going to call Linux people cheapskates, we might as well call the Mac people, you know, the opposite of that. And we're paying more money than them. We're willing to say we value good products, and we're willing to put our money where our mouth is. So that being said, there are a lot of cheapskates out there. I mean, there's a lot. I got started on Linux because the compiler was free, and I didn't have $500 to give Microsoft for Visual Studio. But this GCC thing was pretty awesome. So I think you need to say there are cheapskates, but you need to celebrate that because you're just opening up a bigger market to people that can do beautiful things if they're given those tools. For what it's worth, I don't know.
Okay, enough with your marketing speak there. Next, we're going to hear from a good nonprofit of local Chicago, David Eads. How many GNU Linux desktops did Free Geek deploy last year?
James, do you know?
More prepared for this?
I was prepared for it. I didn't have the exact number. We had roughly 500. We had roughly 500 people complete our program, a few less, and so and then probably and then roughly 550 systems that were sold. So about 1,000 GNU Linux systems that Free Geek put out into Chicago last year.
What I call proliferation. Next, I would like to know how much open source is going on at the Computation Institute.
Well, specifically at the Computation Institute, we actually do a fair amount of open source. We do a fair amount of research into computer science, but we mostly do a lot of computation research at the service of other areas like physics, biology, et cetera, et cetera. And as part of the work of the Computation Institute, there are like certain like a fair amount of like open source that gets produced there. One of the oldest projects that we have there is the Globus project, which I think has gone through various names over the years: Globus Alliance, Globus Toolkit, et cetera, which has been going on for more than 10 years. And it's become one of the sort of prime toolkits for building very, very large distributed systems around the world. One of the, I guess, the things that I'm personally a little bit more proud of is that I guess everyone's heard about the LHC outside of Geneva, the very, very big machine that moves very, very small things at very, very high speeds. And you smash them together and funny things happen. And the amount of computational power that you need to process, like all the data that gets produced by the LHC, like cannot be processed in a single place. You have to literally bury Geneva with a mountain of computers to be able to do it. So you have to spread out the computation across various sites, and they've built this what's called a grid of more than 100 data centers around Europe that basically take care of doing that computation, storing all that data, and all of the services that allow that to happen run the Globus toolkit. So I like to feel that, you know, I've done my little bit to discover the deep mysteries of the universe, despite the fact that I have no idea about physics and stuff like that. I'm a computer scientist, by the way.
And what type of systems does the Globus toolkit run on?
There was a period where there was actually a little bit of a demand for having them run on Windows. That was a dark and terrible period in our history. But it's mostly just Unix systems. And a lot of our development does happen on Linux systems, although some of the developers personally like work on Macs, because if it's, you know, it does have a creamy Unix interior covered by a hard crust of, I'll stop there.
However, sometimes in the real world, that isn't the case. Elizabeth, what security challenges do you see when a site deploys a heterogeneous environment of, say 1,000+ nodes?
So I would say, in my experience in the security space, probably the #1 greatest challenge, as well as probably the number one greatest problem in security, is lack of centralized management. So every time we go to an organization, and I typically stay in the space of somewhere between 1,000 to maybe 5,000 nodes. You know, there's a lot of OSs and applications that are centrally managed, but there's always a lot that are not centrally managed. And those are sort of the attack vectors. If you're doing a vulnerability assessment or a pen test, typically it's those platforms or apps that are not centrally managed which provide the avenue in, because they're always inconsistent, they always lack patches, the configuration, you know, in terms of password policy or locking down the OS or whatever it happens to be, is not consistent, and you can always find that one hole. And I will tell you, my favorite environment is the developers, right? So I go into an environment and I sit on their network, and maybe their internal network is completely locked down. And I sort of get a little frustrated and I move on with my life because I can't break in and own the entire network. Ooh, but then I run across the developers. They've always got something going on in their environment where they have tons of open source servers, databases, and they probably don't have passwords because they think there's no data really. Maybe they're not working with production data. 9 times out of 10, you can get domain admin rights through those developers. So across the board, the lack of control in pushing out security standards and configurations is the #1 thing, regardless of whether it's open source or not. Now, the challenge that's a little bit different with open source is what tools are you going to use to centrally manage, these platforms? To the best of my knowledge, there's not a whole ton of tools out there that will allow you to manage multiple platforms. I know like Puppet's one of them that a lot of people advocate. What I have seen a lot of is organizations or service-based solutions that build their solutions based on open source, and then they write proprietary code on top of that open source to manage the environment. So that's what I see most consistently and most often. So I guess what I would encourage all of those that might be working in the space is to try to make sure that at the very beginning you're thinking about this centralized management as it relates to all aspects of security. So not just the OS patching, but also config files and, pushing out, small patches to your apps or your platforms to fix vulnerabilities. Make sure at the onslaught in the very beginning you're thinking about an automated way to do this, because you can find yourself in a lot of trouble should there be some kind of vulnerability that needs to be patched quickly and you've got to manually touch 1,000 devices and maybe even reboot them or something like that. It can be very painful. The other thing I just want to say is that traditionally, security people are very lazy, and we actually take pride in our laziness because the easier things are to manage and, easier it is to push out updates or whatever it happens to be, the more secure you are. So if I had to close this answer with one word, I would say focus on your laziness, try to be lazy, make life easy.
Well, all right, Elizabeth. I'm going to give you the next question.
It's an operational improvement with the microphone.
Well and good when we had servers and desktops that were stationary, but free and open source has proliferated into the mobile world. I'm talking about Android. What type of attack vectors have you seen there?
It's kind of funny, Beth and I were exchanging emails and things, and she had mentioned this as a topic, and literally just the day before, I'm working on a lot of mobile type scenarios of infections, botnets, and things like that, but the most recent one that just came up the day before was an individual that had gone to a reputable website, and all of a sudden his droid was showing him porn.
That's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, should you happen to visit these websites that offer these features, now, I was just being sincere. But that's typically, like the attack vectors across the board are, the most common is drive-by downloads, right? So you visit a site and they push down some type of malicious code, taking advantage of some type of vulnerability either in your browser or something like that. With Android specifically, most commonly, sorry, I thought you were cutting, okay, I'll make this quick. With Android specifically, the most common attack vector is the apps, right? So the apps become infected, or maybe you visit a site that's not the sanctioned store and you grab an app from some location that may not be trusted. And usually they're infected with, they take advantage of some type of vulnerability in the droid. And then the payload is typically, what I've seen the most common is items such as the premium rate SMS texting, as well as maybe some premium rate phone calls or something like that. There's also, the biggest thing that you have to watch with the droids is that your initial infection means nothing, right? So the initial infection is typically just some type of Trojan or downloader that gains access to the device that will capture whatever PII they can, either to improve their services, all of these attacks are services, right? So in the porn example, you could call that something like a pay-per-click service. So whoever pushed out this infection is actually making money for each time the porn site is launched. So when you think about getting infected on a droid, there's the initial infection that gains access to the device. But beyond that, there's some degree usually of command and control where they're constantly going to push new things out. So it could be premium rate SMSs, could be porn, could be pop-ups, could be fake AV. There actually is fake AV out there for Droid, and that's actually a pay-per-install revenue base. So they get paid for each one of the installs. But I guess in summary, attack vectors predominantly are through apps, but I also think that there's some drive-by downloads going on out there. I just don't have that proof yet.
Okay, Mr. Linux gaming industry who happens to use an iPhone on stage.
I was tweeting, actually.
What kind of usability issues are you seeing on the Android platform?
On Android?
Yes, on Android.
You want me to talk about usability on Android?
Yes, that's what we're talking about.
Where do I start? The entire system looks like a freshman college experience in software development. It's just the UI is terrible on it. The UI is a bad copy of iOS. And I don't want to be that guy that says that, but it's absolutely true. And you can see this with one exception, which I'll get to in a second, is that every time there's a new feature in the next version of iOS or the new iPhone or iPad or whatever, inevitably, including the pad itself, when you look at the Android tablets that showed up in response to the iPad, every time Apple does something, you see kind of like a half-assed version of it show up in the next version of Android. It's embarrassing. They should be innovating. They shouldn't be copying. That being said, I couldn't help but notice how iOS 5 added a notification thing that you drag down from the top. So I like that there's cross-pollination. That's a huge win, I think. But I don't think you could seriously suggest that the user interface on Android is good in almost any way. And I say this as someone who likes the command line and has seen a lot of really bad user interfaces over the last 15 years in Linux and, well, frankly, on most platforms. But I don't know. I'm kind of surprised. It's terrible. I have nothing good to say about it at all.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up how outside of free culture is influencing free culture. How about the other way? David, what, in your opinion, is the level of proliferation of free culture?
So this is a tricky question to answer. What is the level of proliferation of free culture? First, you have to answer what is free culture, which isn't necessarily the clearest answer. And then I think you have to... I'm not a historian. It's hard to know. There's been forms of free culture for a very long time, right? So like... and forms of free culture that sort of that is geeks we don't necessarily see. So in the housing projects where I used to work, there was a guy who would stick Nike logos onto your sweatpants that you bought from Target, which I consider sort of a form of free culture, right? Like you're sort of taking something and you're hacking it so that it's the thing that you wanted. And
sweatpants or his own?
yeah, he was putting on other people's sweatpants.
Well, that's a political statement. That's not, you know.
Well, I mean, it's a necessity of life if you're poor, right? Like if you want fancy clothes and you're poor, you go to somebody who will sew a Nike logo onto your sweatpants. So what is the level? I don't know what the level is, but what I do know is that I believe that free culture is really important. I believe that it's something that we can do as a society. And I believe that in the face of sort of environmental destruction and recession and a lot of other sort of really major problems, it's actually something that we must do. We must find ways to sort of use our resources better, to share with each other better, and to encourage sort of a better citizenry.
Thank you, David. I believe that a society should, from the best and the brightest, produce a good example of how to implement open source and embrace free culture. Borja, what challenges do you see in academia when it comes to releasing code and other works under free licenses?
So this is actually a problem that I'm really interested in, and I guess to provide a little bit more background about myself, I've been doing research in distributed systems for nearly 10 years, but I've also been fairly active in open source. I've been a contributor to the Globus project. I've been involved in Google Summer of Code as a mentor and administrator for 4 years. I'm the community manager for the Open Nebula project. I've been involved in a variety of documentation efforts and so on and so forth. So I've done sort of like academic research, but I've also been partly in my free time and partly as part of my job as a scientist. I've been involved in the open source community. And it's been interesting to see what happens at the intersection of both communities. And surprisingly, I mean, most scientists are more than happy, are enthusiastic users of open source software. And you know, in fact, so the free software movement kind of like came out of this academic culture, a very specific sort of like subset of it, you know, the MIT hacking culture, but it came out of this whole notion of like knowledge should be shared, knowledge should be free, et cetera, and we should apply that to software too. So people are usually more than happy to use free and open source software. But surprisingly, most scientists do not open source their code. And I'm talking mostly about non-computer scientists. Computer scientists, usually the type of projects that they propose, the kind of grants that they get, you know, have as an explicit goal, you know, we are going to produce this software to be used by the community. And there are actually some NSF programs that specifically mandate that the code must be open source. But if you're a biologist, if you're a physicist, if you're, you know, another type of anything but a computer scientist, most of the NSF programs, if you're going to be writing code as part of your research, as most scientists do nowadays, especially with the proliferation of big data, there's actually no requirement that you have to publish that code. There is a very strong emphasis on the data must be public. And now you actually do have to submit, when you do a grant proposal, you have to submit what's called a data management plan, where you have to describe, this is how I'm going to sort of curate the data, make it available, et cetera, et cetera. But software is considered sort of a second-class citizen in all this process. It's sort of considered something of a side effect to the data. Oh, you wrote software to write the data and to write the results, but we don't care about the software. We just want to see the data. But that makes such an impact on the reproducibility of scientific results, because if I get a paper, I can see a description, a fuzzy-wuzzy description of an algorithm or the process that was used to produce a chart, but I would have to re-implement everything from scratch myself, and there's you know, the NSF has this sort of like very polite language, non-committal language that says stuff like, we encourage you to, if you're approached by other researchers, you should share, yada, yada, but there's no like hard, fast requirement, not just from the funding agencies, but also from journals and conferences and so on and so forth. There's a few journals, like for example, Science now actually does require you to submit code with a paper. Nature does not, for example. Let's see, actually I think a journal is just called Biostatistics. Like they actually have a person on staff, an editor that's in charge of sort of like receiving code and testing reproducibility and stuff like that. But most people don't bother to publish their code because they either feel that it's not polished enough, that it's, you know, or that someone's going to scoop their results and stuff like that. So I think that there's actually like still like a lot left to be done in terms of scientists actually actively buying into the open source culture of we should be releasing all this software openly. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's still quite a bit to do.
Well, excellent. We talked about the status within free culture. We've talked about the status within academia. But what about commercial spaces? Elizabeth, do you want to discuss some examples of some open source projects that have proliferated when they crossed over to commercial models?
Yeah, I think that's an awesome topic because, well, first of all, Borja, to respond to you made a statement that software is a second-class citizen.
In science.
In science, don't feel bad because in university or most environments, security is like a fourth, fifth, or sixth-class citizen. So you're doing pretty good if you're a second-class citizen. But to respond to your comment, one thing I love about the security industry is that we have endless counts and endless supplies of projects that started as open source that either were acquired by a commercial vendor or had developed a solution on open source platform and then offered services. So, I mean, just off the top of my head, if you look at some of the most popular toolkits that are used for vulnerability assessment or pen testing, Metasploit is open source, and Rapid7 had actually acquired this technology to incorporate it into their vulnerability scanner, and now they offer a community version. I don't know what the licensing is, to be honest. I don't know if it's open source, GNU, or whatever, but it's free, right? Nessus is another example of an open source scanner that also offers a commercial version. If you look at, if you dig into a lot of the managed services that are out there, 9 times out of 10, a lot of them will at least offer services on top of open source solutions. So like Snort is an open source intrusion detection system. A lot of commercial managed services are actually building at least a service line based on that solution, and they're adding value to it. And then in terms of existing open source tools for managing your secure environment that are not yet commercial, there's products like Security Onion, which is an open source platform for collecting security events from IDSs and logs and things like that. And I'm sure, I hope for this guy that it does get acquired at some point. He puts a ton of work in it, and it's a great project. In addition to that, there's one more I can't think of off the top of my head. OSSEC, OSSEC is an open source platform that offers intrusion detection, file integrity monitoring, a log management solution, and they also have a commercial version that they sell as well. So if you look through the years, there's been, I would actually argue that there are more commercial security solutions that started as open source solutions than there are not. So I think that A, it's just good for the community, and then B, I think it's a good project to start as long as it fills a space in the marketplace.
Well, excellent. My next question is for Borja. How much open source is produced by the Computation Institute? Would you consider Globus produced by the Computation Institute? And also, I'd find it interesting if you have any information on your market share or download tracking or anything like that.
So in terms of specific numbers, I did try to find that information before coming in. I couldn't find the right person, or the right person maybe didn't want to make himself available to me to reveal that data, although I know that it is somewhere. But so the Globus toolkit is primarily produced by the Computation Institute at the University of Chicago, and that also includes people at Argonne National Lab. It also involves collaborators from all around the world. We do have a lot of people in Europe who very actively use Globus, and I know that there was this is a very dated figure, but I think that back in 2008 there was about 1,000 high-performance file servers that were moving. Now we're up to the order of petabytes of data being moved fairly frequently with these kind of high-performance file servers and stuff like that. But I can't really quantify. I can't give an exact number, but I can say that the kind of systems that have been built with Globus, these computational grids, and sort of one of the biggest ones out there is the one that's used for the LHC. Typically involve getting more than 100, or dozens, or sometimes hundreds of different resource providers, data centers, universities, labs, etc., each with heterogeneous resources, different security policies, etc., etc. And Globus is sort of the glue code that manages to get all of those systems to work together to solve these phenomenal problems, analyzing the data coming out of the LHC, and also just providing more, allowing easier access to computational resources from scientists who might be at institutions that don't have access to them, because these grid systems also provide a pool of resources that you can access for much smaller problems than the LHC. The LHC is a very sexy problem because it's so always in the news and so on, but not everyone has a particle accelerator in their backyard. So I wish I did.
Well, we're going to save audience questions to the end. Yes, not everybody has a particle accelerator in their backyard, and it really does amaze me how much energy is used to solve these extremely intense computation problems. But what about some of the problems that are closer to home, like the digital divide? David, at Free Geek, have you seen your electric bill?
So I told Beth before this I would have a funny electric bill story. So at Free Geek Chicago, and I should mention two things before I go too far. One is that I'm also a data reporter for the Chicago Tribune, which I'm obligated to tell you guys, but it's also a lot of fun. And the other thing is that you can find Free Geek Chicago at freegeekchicago.org on the internet and learn all about us. We have never seen our electric bill because our landlord was in a legal dispute with another tenant in the building over, he basically used their electric, or he basically, they paid his electric bill for many years. So we haven't seen an electric bill. So stay tuned. Next month we'll find out exactly how much it costs to run the computers at Free Geek. Do you want me to talk about the digital divide more? What do you?
Well, I guess that means that the fundraising drive starts here and now.
Well, yeah, that's true. Come make a donation to Chicago.
Since we're on the topic of fundraising, the Linux gaming, yes. Why does the Hubble Bundle contribute to charity, and what are the types of charities it has contributed to?
Why does it contribute to those specifically?
Yes.
Well, specifically, I think at one point, I think there was one anomaly where we did the Red Cross or something like that. I'm not sure. I'm not privy to these decisions specifically, but for the most part, all the bundles, for those that don't, I'll explain this very quickly. For those that don't know, they put up a bundle of like 5 or 6 games, and they say, give us whatever money you can for this. We don't, if you want to pay a penny, you can pay a penny. If you want to pay $100, pay $100. If you pay less than $1, it puts up a picture of a homeless developer saying, we'll write games for food. Which you laugh, but you know what? Psychology is important. I think that actually bumps people up to $1. If you do less than $1, I think they make $0 on it because PayPal will take the entire penny you give them. But you pay whatever you want. You get these 6 games. There's no DRM in them, so you're not restricted on where you can play them. And by law, they all come with Windows, Mac, and Linux versions. And this current bundle is Windows, Mac, Linux, and Android. Which is awesome. It's done a lot of good for the Linux community, I think. But part of your donation, and you can specify this, if you really hate a developer, you can say, don't give that specific developer any money. I want my money to go to the other game developers, which people have done. But also, part of your purchase goes to charity. And you can also just move the slider and say, I want it all to go to charity, and the game developers get nothing. That's okay, too. And none of the developers would ever, cry that you're going to give their money to Child's Play instead. But the 2 charities they keep using are Child's Play and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which should matter a lot if you're a gamer or a Linux user. Child's Play basically is a charity that puts video game consoles into hospitals for sick children. And, it's like if you could just get like little kittens in there or something too, it'd be the perfect heartwarming charity. They're really good. If that's something that's important, you want to make a sick child happy, give money to Child's Play. If you care about your digital rights on the internet and you care about patents and copyrights and big companies sitting on little people, then you need to give money to the EFF, whether you buy these video games or not. It's the most important issue for technologically minded people this decade, and you're only hurting yourself if you don't support these people. So why they picked those, I don't know why specifically, but Linux is always, multi-platform has always been important to the Humble Bundle, and Linux has always been, and I think it's really fortunate that that's also an audience that would really, really like the EFF. I would be upset if my choices were charities that I don't believe in, because there's charities out there that are wasteful, there's charities out there that do things I find atrocious. I think it's nice that there's ones that appeal to geeks and nerds, or whatever we're calling ourselves this week, but every time you buy a game through the Humble Bundle, you're doing something to protect your rights and your quality of life on the internet. So that's my hard sell. I don't get any of that money, whether it goes to the developers or the charities, but I think it's a worthwhile thing, and I think it's part of why people throw money at it. Some people do show up, they're like, I get some games, but I get to do some good for the world. So, and I think that has always been part of the trade-off in using Linux and using open source, is that it's not about you getting a cheaper product, it's about you making the world a better place, if you're responsible about it. So,
Well, there are the platforms that you just mentioned, and then there is the platform that every tech conference always has to mention, the cloud. Elizabeth, what should be the consumer's highest concern when using a cloud-based application?
It's an interesting question. I'm going to first plug the Cloud Security Alliance. Admittedly, shameless plug. I help run the Cloud Security Alliance Chicago chapter here in Chicago. We have meetings, chapter meetings every other month, as well as working groups. All are welcome. Please come and contribute, or please come and learn. It's also a great opportunity if you're a student looking to get, some exposure in the industry. So Google Cloud Security Alliance Chicago chapter, and we'd love to have you. Next meeting, I think May 5th. It's the first Wednesday of every month. When using applications in the cloud, as a consumer, and I'm going to direct this answer to more of the end user consumer base as opposed to the business, what you have to understand is, the very first topic, and I think that we all know this, is if you're not paying for something, you are the product, right? So a lot of these social networking sites, may or may not be built on cloud, but just keep in mind, obviously if there's anything free, pay attention to what data that application is collecting from you and what data is being sent. Read the policies, read the terms of use, and understand what they're doing with your data. But when I talk to a lot of clients, a lot of the data that they're dealing with is regulated data. So, for example, I went to a meetup here in Chicago, and there was a lot of developers that were developing apps that were going to be consumer-based. They were going to be built on EC2 or some type of cloud services. And the idea was that you would be able to input something about your health problem and be able to get a list of services back. So, that's a situation where you're the consumer and you're providing your health information to this app, but you don't necessarily know where this data is going, right? You have no idea. The very nature of cloud-based services precludes you from knowing where it is geographically. Now, mostly geographical issues, that's more of an EU type problem because European Union personal data cannot leave the soil. But I would say that that's, number one thing is, where is your data going? What data are you sending them is the number one question. Number two question is, where is it going? And then number three, now as a consumer, I don't know how much you can look at this, but you always have to be concerned about the security of the application, right? So if you're using an app, and again, it's some type of sensitive confidential data, you can't assume that it's going to be secure. You can't assume that, the developers are ensuring it's not vulnerable to, like I said earlier, on Droids, drive-by downloads or something like that. So it can be challenging. I personally, for myself, when it comes to cloud-based services, there's some things that I will do free and clear. So for example, in managing like the Cloud Security Alliance, or besides, another shameless plug, besides Chicago. When we're doing these types of things, we don't have confidential data, so we just throw it up there. You know, we try to protect it in terms of permission so that people can't edit it and, you know, replace it. But from that standpoint, I'm pretty free and clear. Like, I understand that that data might go away at any given moment. There's no guarantees it will be available. I understand and I fully accept that it may be compromised at any given moment, and I'm okay with that. There's other things that I simply will not do in a cloud environment. I won't do anything financial. I certainly, absolutely, from a business perspective, will not use Google Docs or Dropbox or anything like that for any sensitive client information. I can't do it. I simply can't. I'm in security, right? So I can't take a chance, and I don't trust them. And we're not yet at a point in the cloud industry where you can trust all of the providers until we get some more industry acceptance of certain standards and things like that. So I guess, you know, as consumers, I would say just watch what you're doing. Don't trust, you know, the app itself. Assume it's not going to be secure. And please, 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 for the love of God, when you're doing things on Droid, watch where you get these apps and be careful because there's so many of them that are infected. It's a challenge right now, which I'm sure you know if you're a Droid user.
Yes, of course.
I just want to say, Android gets a bad rap, but don't trust your iOS apps either. And if anyone thinks there's a legitimate review process at Apple that makes it safer, there is not. There's not a single bit. They don't know. It's an arms race. You can't stop a malicious person from getting something in the store. And you probably have something on your phone right now that's malicious, and it's just waiting. How would you ever know? This guy wants to ask a question.
Can I respond to that very quickly? May I? That's actually a very good point, and we're sort of living in a world where at any given moment, I'm pretty confident there's going to be some type of compromises through apps in the iOS store. There is a degree of vetting, and there's a difference between Droid and Apple, you know, about iOS running in a sandbox, and I'm not going to get into that. That could be a religious debate, but point is, any given moment, and there have been proof of concept compromises of that Apple store that have occurred where it was potentially vulnerable or, you know, doing something it shouldn't have been doing, and it still made it through the App Store. So, good point. Less proliferated, right? I like that. Less proliferated right at the moment on iOS, but it's just a matter of time.
Well, excellent. Before we take out audience questions very quickly, Borja, anything that you want to proliferate?
Well, actually, I do have a quick plug. Richard Stallman. He's going to be at the University of Chicago this Monday at 1 p.m. Assembly Hall of the International House. It's an open event. Everyone can come. You should all come. It'll be fun. He's a great speaker. I have just proliferated the cause of free software.
How about you, Devin? Anything that you want to proliferate?
Free Geek Chicago, freegeekchicago.org, as well as our Drupal-based community organizing platform, Town Square, which just had a release the other week. That's github.com/freegeekchicago/Town Square. So if you're a Drupal developer, we need your help. GitHub/freegeekchicago/Town Square.
Yeah, I'm sure you're all typing that in right now.
Linux gaming industry, what do you want to proliferate?
I just want to say that the worst thing you can do to proliferate free software is sit Richard Stallman in front of an audience.
He gives really good talks. Like if you only watch him.
So does the crazy guy in the urine-soaked suit on the corner holding up the end his nigh sign. I'm up here in terms of proliferation because I think I don't have anything to promote specifically, I'm sorry. Video games have always been important. Every time I talk to somebody that knows my work, they go, oh, I would totally delete this NTFS partition if I could just get this certain game on Linux. And I've helped in some ways, in some small way, I think, but I really do think that video games are always the gateway. And I think that part of what made iOS popular wasn't so much that iOS was better, although that's always debatable. But I think it was Angry Birds was there first. And I think that, I mean, it's always going to be, this game was on the Xbox, and that's why it beat the PlayStation 3. And, the Wii had this really cool thing, and that's why Nintendo kicked way more ass than they should have in this generation and stuff like that. So if you want to do something to make Linux more popular, write a game. It's really just about that simple. And if you can't, go buy a game from somebody that sells them, which I don't. Okay, good.
Elizabeth, anything you want to proliferate?
So one last thing I want to mention to everybody to ensure that you're aware of it is myself and some of my friends in the crowd are helping organize Besides Chicago. It is Security Besides as a national organization. There's something somewhere around 30 or 40 local events, and it's designed to offer a free security conference in certain locales. So this year's conference is going to be April 28th at the Bottom Lounge, 1375 West Lake Street. Google Besides Chicago 2012. Make sure you put the 2012 in there, otherwise you might get last year's. Yeah, B-sides, as in A-side, B-side. We're going to have some great speakers. We've got some great workshops. We've got Workshop 88 coming in. We've got a lockpicking village. We have a Metasploit workshop, as well as fantastic speakers. So right now it's currently full, but we do have a waiting list, and we do expect more tickets to open up in the future. So again, Besides Chicago 2012, stop by.
It sounds like you've over-proliferated. Okay. We have time for, let's do 3 questions. That sounds great. Okay. You, and you. Okay. Gentleman in the back corner. Trojans by the hardware manufacturer / phone manufacturer, repeating the question for the recording in the Linux gaming industry, would like to answer this.
My name's Ryan, by the way. I don't know. When you say Trojan by the carrier, you mean like, you don't mean actual Trojans, you mean like shovelware, like crap you can't get off your phone that... Like carrier IQ and stuff. Well, yeah, I was going to say the best thing, you have 2 options there. You can pick a different carrier or a different phone maker. It's not always the carrier. Or you can hack your phone. That's the beauty of Android. You can jailbreak it without much consequence, as opposed to an iPhone where you kind of live on the edge to do it on iOS. But screw it, Android, just put a Cyanogen mod on there and just say, you guys are done. You got my money because I needed the hardware, but I don't want your crappy software. And problem solved. So they're not going to give you an update anyway. You might as well do it. So.
Okay, is it Evil Joel? Yes. Okay, your question.
Ryan, you plugged the 2 charities, Child's Play and EFF. You tried Charity Water. Everyone knows what Red Cross does, but do you know what Charity Water does? You want to plug that?
I don't know Charity Water.
That was the Mojam bundle. Okay. They had a 3rd charity or a 4th charity called Charity Water, and they basically give people water, ways to I think they build wells in Africa and other places to give people clean water, and that's really essential for cleaning and for hygiene and for drinking, for food. So they're another great charity that I feel that you guys should all be aware of. And we tried to work with them in last year's Flourish. We tried to do a program expense for them. It didn't work out. So I actually did look into them, and they're worthwhile charity.
Okay, Evil Joel is proliferating charity water. Okay, the last question. Make it good. No pressure.
So before you decide to quit that corporate job today and embrace open source for living, what avenues do I have? Where can you find me? Assuming that, I'm smart enough to design whatever this is, what, if I just quit my job today and then just do the contribution to open source, where would it?
The question was, how do you get involved in and?
How do you survive off of that?
Oh, okay. It's open developers paying the bills.
I got this one covered. Does anyone else want to take this before I? No? Okay.
I'd like to touch it.
Okay, I'll talk quickly. I'll hand it to you. How's that sound? Okay. You're asking what if I quit my job and do nothing but open source development? How do I eat? How do I feed my family? The answer is don't quit your job right away, but start committing to open source projects. Okay, well, it's, go panhandle on the street and then, commit to open source projects, and there are lots and lots of people that want to do one of two things. There's open source companies at Red Hat that would love to hire you to do nothing but open source if you can prove that you're not a dipshit. And the best way to prove that is to contribute to open source projects that they care about, and the Linux kernel, Apache. Some of those are really high level and complicated. Some are not so high level and complicated. There's a lot of good little GNOME programs that need updates and improvements. And if you just build a track record, that's fantastic. That builds you a resume for open source companies. More importantly than that, everyone in here that's ever tried to hire someone has realized that 90% of the job applicants that come in can't program at all and have never even tried. Am I wrong about this? I am so tired of interviewing people that don't know what a pointer is. But if I were hiring people, I would absolutely go to the person that has a whole list of interactions on mailing lists where they had good cooperation and gave good feedback and wrote good code and cooperated with people. Not just, I wrote this and I'm awesome, fuck you, commit it. Just actually, collaborated with people. And you can see that they can get along well with others and they write good code and you have an entire archive of it in open source stuff. All you're doing there, at a minimum, is building an awesome resume that nobody gets just by going through college and, I worked at Microsoft or I worked at IBM. Show me what you can do. Lots of good people, lots of bad programmers have gotten jobs at good companies. But if you can show me nice open source software you've done, you're 20 times more likely to get hired. And push that. When you go on a resume, here's links to stuff I did. Here's mailing list stuff that I did. Here's contributions and how I changed it based on feedback I got. And here's how someone was really rude to me and I handled it coolly. And I was polite to them back. They like to see that. Any company likes to see that. So can you make money off of open source? If you're lucky, you can be MySQL and get bought by Sun Microsystems. But most of us are not going to cash out that way, but it can definitely lead to any job you want. That's all I was going to say about that. I don't know.
I would strongly sort of support that, and personally, my entire career has been built out of writing open source software, and starting with WordPress and moving into Drupal and now doing Django and Python for the Chicago Tribune. There's lots of opportunities to do open source in places where you might not expect it. For whatever reason, because, in the case of the Tribune, it was because somebody there was like, who used to be a sports editor said, I want a news applications team that's willing to sort of show its work. And the other thing is just that open source is really big business. So as of I think like 2010, 70%, at least 70% of all contributions to the Linux kernel came from a big company. And so there's lots and lots and lots of opportunities if you have this sort of public profile in the open source world to be able to make some money for yourself. The one thing I will say is that it requires some hustle, and that hustle means that your cash flow is going to expand and it's going to shrink as your career gets off the ground, and that can be pretty rough.
Yeah. So besides agreeing with everything that's been said, I think that's especially the point about if you really want to get a job involving open source, like the best credential you can have like on your resume is a link to your GitHub account, pretty much. But for those of you who are students, I'd be remiss if I didn't plug Google Summer of Code, because it gives you an opportunity to get into open source in a much more structured fashion, because you are assigned to a mentor from an established open source project that will guide you through, contributing to a project, being in mailing lists, dealing with the egos in the open source community, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of projects do regard Summer of Code as essentially a 3-month interview. Like they get to see how you code, how you work. And speaking just for Globus, we've hired people who have been Summer of Code students because they've proven to us that they're really, really good programmers, and then when they come to work for us, they continue developing really high quality open source software. But I mean, the main takeaway, yes, is that the best credential you can have is actual code that you can point to and say I did that.
And if you're already there, be a mentor.
Also, as a counterpoint, if you do a shitty job on the Google side of code, we tell your employers. We've done that before. We've had bad submissions from people before. People have vanished, and we're happy to tell you that too. So if you have that opportunity, don't squander it. It's very, I've had a lot of people squander it. It's sad every time. So.
I'm coming from a little bit different perspective. From a security standpoint, the one thing I will tell you is that a lot of people in our industry, they want to get into pen testing, right? So it's kind of the same question. How do you do that? And I'll tell you, nights and weekends, that's how you do it. You keep your day job, and you work hard during the day, and you join the community and contribute to the community and be able to point to something. But everything I learned on that front was nights and weekends. It was my second and third job, and that's how you break into a lot of things.
That was a really good question, by the way. Thank you.
On that note, we have to close the panel, and this pretty much concludes Flourish. I had a blast of a time. We have some lightning talks coming up. Who is here to do a lightning talk? Okay.